Number one president would be Barack Obama. One of his policies was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, a $831 billion economic stimulus package aimed at helping the economy recover from the deepening worldwide recession. The act would increase federal spending by $573 billion for healthcare, infrastructure, education, and social benefits, with the remainder to use for tax relief, including a $116 billion income tax cut that benefited 95% of working families. One of the crises Barack Obama faced was in the depths of a Great Recession and a severe financial crisis that began in 2007. His administration continued the banking bailout and auto industry rescue begun by the previous administration and immediately enacted an $800 billion stimulus program, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. President Obama followed the legislation that bears his name, Obamacare, the 2010 Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, also known as ACA. By 2016, the law covered approximately 24 million people with health insurance via a combination of state healthcare exchanges and an extension of Medicaid. It lowered the rate of those without health insurance from approximately 16% in 2010 to 9% by 2015.
Number 2. Jimmy Carter. In November 1979, a mob of Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took its diplomatic staff hostages as protest against the arrival of the United States of the deposed Iran Shah, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, in order to receive medical treatment. The students had full support of Iran's revolutionary government, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Carter stood firm in the tense standoff that followed, but his failure to free the hostages led his government to be perceived as inept and insufficient. This perception increased after the failure of a secret U.S. military mission of April 1980. Policies. When Jimmy Carter took over as president, energy policy was one of the greatest challenges facing the nation. The United States at the time consumed twice as much energy per capita as other perceived developed nations. So on August 4th, 1977, President Carter signed into law the Department of Energy Organization Act. They aimed to formulate and implement comprehensive long-term national energy strategies. Its other responsibilities included energy conversion, conservation, energy-related research, radioactive waste disposal, and domestic energy production. Economy. Carter took over office during a period of stagflation as the economy experienced both high and low economic growth. The U.S. had recovered from the 1973-1975 recession, but the economy and especially inflation continued to be a top concern for many Americans from 1977 and 1978. The economy had grown 5% in 1976 and continued to grow at a similar pace during 1977 and 1978. Unemployment declined 7.5% in January 1977 to 5.6% in May of 1979, with over 9 million new jobs created during the interim.
Our third president would be Ronald Reagan. The domestic policy of the Ronald Reagan administration from 1981 to 1989. Reagan policies stressed the conservative economic values, starting with his implementation of supply-side economic policies, dubbed as Reaganomics. His policies also included the largest tax cut in American history, as well as increased defense spending as part of Soviet strategy. However, he significantly raised non-income taxes 4 times due to economic conditions and reforms, but the tax reforms instituted during presidency brought top marginal rates to their lowest level since 1931, such that by 1988, the top U.S. marginal tax rate was 28%. In foreign affairs, Ronald Reagan's first term in office was marked by a massive buildup of U.S. weapons and troops, as well as an escalation of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which the president dubbed as the Evil Empire. Key to his administration's foreign policy initiatives was the Reagan Doctrine, under which America provided aid to anti-communist movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In 1983, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a plan to develop space-based weapons to protect America from attacks by the Soviet nuclear missiles. President Ronald Reagan found himself in the middle of the Iran-Contra affair. Senior administration officials frequently facilitated the sale of arms to Iran. The plan was further deepened when funds from the arms sales were used to fund anti-communist death squads in Nicaragua. While there is little evidence that directly links Reagan with the funding of the rebels in Nicaragua, his administration has been accused of actively sabotaging the investigation by withholding or destroying evidence.
Number 4. George H.W. Bush.
Policies. The passage of the landmark Americans with Disability Act, also known as ADA, was one of the most prominent domestic policy accomplishments during Bush's presidency. It impacted over 43 million Americans. Bush signed a comprehensive piece of civil rights legislation into law in July 1990, giving people with handicaps access to facilities and prohibiting discrimination in employment, public accommodations, and transportation. Over the next two decades, doors, stairs, and sidewalks, disengage, and employment laws were revised across the country in response to the legislation. Another important legislation signed into law by Bush was the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. International affairs. Reagan's policies were ones that brought the Cold War to a successful conclusion. It didn't happen until after he left office. Bush had already been president for 10 months when the Berlin Wall fell, but the policies that made it happen were Reagan's along with those of four allies in Europe. Bush, who knew a lot about the Soviets from his other jobs, played a role in shaping these policies too. Economy. The U.S. economy had generally performed well since emerging from the recession of late 1982, but finally slipped into a mid-recession in 1990. The unemployment rate rose from 5.9% in 1989 to a high 7.8% in the mid-1991. A number of high publicized early layoffs such as Italian Life and Casually were middle-class jobs, which led some to call it a white recession in a point of law fact by late 1991. Therefore, had been more than 1 million blue-collar jobs lost compared to approximately 200,000 white-collar jobs lost for a 5-to-1 ratio. Even so, this was still more a white-collar recession by comparison than the early 1980s double-dip recession had been.
Our fifth president would be Bill Clinton. One of the policies he set was the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, was a lengthy crime control bill that was put together over the course of 6 years. Its provisions implemented many things, including a 3 strikes, mandatory life sentence for repeat offenders, money to hire hundreds of thousands new police officers, and $9.7 billion in funding for prisons, and an expansion of death penalty in eligible offenses. It also dedicated $6.1 billion to prevention programs. However, the bulk of funds were dedicated to measures that are seen as punitive rather than rehabilitative or preventative. Clinton faced a scandal in the second term. On December 1998, the U.S. House of Representatives impeached him for perjury and obstruction of justice in connection with the sexual relationship he had with the White House intern Monica Lewinsky between late 1995 and early 1997. On February 12, 1999, the U.S. Senate acquitted the president of the charges and he remained in office. Bill Clinton came to office while the United States was still recovering from the Great Recession that began in 1991. The country was suffering from rising interest rates and declining prices of the U.S. government debt as a result of growing budget deficits. His first significant piece of economic legislation, the Deficit Reduction Act of 1993, enacted budget cuts and tax increases on wealthy Americans, a move that was politically unpopular but which calmed bond markets.